Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Thursday lunchtime lecture from us here at the Church's Conservation Trust. It really is fantastic to be. It's great that here in England we've obviously just had half term. We've had a lovely bank holiday weekend, so it's nice that the weather's starting to cheer up as we can now go and visit some of our churches. So today we are joined by Jon Wright, who's going to be talking to us a bit about Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral and some of the conservation challenges and the history of this wonderful, wonderful cathedral. But before we go into the lecture, as is usual, we're going to do Church of the Week. So for the next 10 minutes, me and our Chief Executive is going to talk to you about a specific church in our care and tell you a bit more about it. So I'm going to play a quick video for those of you who have been here before, and then we'll get underway with Church of the Week.
The Church's Conservation Trust brings you Church of the Week.
Hello everybody and welcome once again to Church of the Week. I'm Peter Ayres, I'm the Chief Executive of the Church's Conservation Trust. First of all, I'd like to thank Ecclesiastical Insurance, who have sponsored Church of the Week and their ongoing support to the lunchtime lectures. Also to the Royal School of Church Music, who provided that fantastic jingle beforehand. Now, we don't have any cathedral churches in our care at the CCT, but we have some built on cathedral proportions. And today's Church of the Week is close to the banks of the Mersey, and it's lovingly called the Cathedral of Waterloo. It is, in fact, Christchurch, Waterloo. Christchurch was built in 1891 to 99 to replace a much humbler building and to keep up with the increasing prosperity of this rapidly growing suburb of Liverpool. Its majestic tower of pink sandstone became a landmark for sailors and still dominates the neighbourhood. The present church was built to designs by Austin and Paley of Preston, and Nicholas Pevsner even referred to Christchurch as one of the finest churches in the country ever built by this practice. We own some other churches by Paley and Austin as well, one being All Souls Bolton. Sadly, during World War II, bombs fell and caused damage to the church, mainly blowing out the glass in the Lady Chapel and weakening the foundations in certain areas. Sorry, I'm just having trouble, as always, changing the slide. There we go. By about 1980, the congregation had dwindled, and in about 1982, the church was declared redundant and fell into disrepair. These illustrations show that perfectly well. In 1993, the church was in a very sorry state, so a demolition scheme was published. As a result of these objections, a non-statutory public inquiry was held and resulted in the church being vested in, guess who? Yes, that's right, the Church's Conservation Trust. Sadly, churches in England can still be demolished, which is why our work is so important. Here you can see the damage caused by vandals at the windows, which were boarded up. Sadly, during this period, before the vesting in our care, vandals targeted the glass, and we'll show you just shortly how special the glass is here. Upon being vested with us, we embarked on a major programme of repair works, which we always do when we get a new vesting into the organisation. We repaired the roofs, dealt with dry rot, and later repaired the windows and restored the interior. This is the view today looking towards the chancel. Here you can see the exterior of this lovely church. On the top, you just might be able to make out the Latin inscription reading Laudate Dominum, which is the first part of Psalm 116 and translates as Praise the Lord. The glass at this church is spectacular and is one of the largest surviving collections of glass by Shrigley and Hunt, which remains intact and in its original location. The east window uses the theme of the Te Deum. It depicts Christ with the four archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael and Uriel, in the centre lights with angels above. On the four outer lights are Abraham, Gideon, Moses, Aaron, Isaiah and David, and on the left, St. Peter, St. John, St. Elizabeth, St. Agnes, St. Stephen and St. Ambrose on the right. Here's a close-up view of those centre panels depicting Christ in majesty. This is the west window, and you have the 12 apostles here, the angels with shields of 11 dioceses of the northern province. Last year, we received £55,000 from the Heritage Stimulus Fund to carry out urgent repairs to re-lead this fine stained glass window and undertake urgent stonework repairs to the west window. Christchurch is a jewel in our crown and shows how important our vision and strategy is. One of the main pillars of our strategy is to empower local communities and volunteers to use and love historic church buildings. And the Friends of Old Christchurch are certainly doing that job to a great extent here. Each year, this church usually welcomes over 25,000 people through a fantastic events programme from, as you can see, beer festivals, art exhibitions, and even farmers markets. During lockdown, these volunteers have done a terrific job of raising funds, organising bookings for the church, and helping us care for this church. So if you have a CCT church near you that you've been interested in holding a community event in, please do get in touch with us, as these buildings deserve to be used and loved by our communities for whom they were built.
Thank you so much, Peter. And everyone, that brings Church of the Week today. So that going to be doing asking Peter some questions. So if you've got any questions for Peter, please do comment away and let us know what your questions are. But Peter, I suppose one of the first things that we should talk about is at Christchurch Waterloo, they've got a fantastic friends group and they've got a really strong support-based volunteers. How important are volunteers to the work of the Trust?
Well, the volunteers are fundamental, and this being Volunteering Week this week nationally, I would just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's engaged in our buildings and supports them through the work that they do. The volunteers are the people that care for these buildings. We don't have enough staff to make sure that we can be on site all the time, look after these, organise events and everything. But really, we have this amazing collection of well over 2,000 people across the country, and they're just the ones we have on a list. There's many, many more who engage with these buildings, organise events, make sure that they're open to the public, clean them, sweep them, love them, and use them. And I'm always blown away by the dedication that people show to these fantastic collection of buildings. And that's why I see it as our job to support these volunteers, to help them do the best they can for their building. And that's what they really care about.
And I suppose, Peter, for those who are watching, if you've got a CCT church close to you, what would your advice be to them if they wanted to inquire about maybe joining us as a volunteer? What can they do?
Well, the best thing to do is have a look on our website and you'll see the church, look up the church that's there, and there should be the details of a person you can get in touch with to see how you can engage. Some groups, there are a variety of different groups that we have. Some are registered charities in their own right, some are organised groups, some are much looser based groups, and we can put you in touch with the right people. Or you may want to volunteer for the Church's Conservation Trust as well. We have lots of interesting roles. Our volunteer roles that we have open at the moment, you can also be found on our website under the Join Us link. You can have a look there, and there's a variety of volunteering roles that are available at the moment. But just get in touch. All the ways that you can get in touch are on our website, and hopefully we can find something that suits you.
Thanks so much, Peter. And everyone, that brings our allotted time for Church of the Week to a close for this week. So this week, that was Christchurch Waterloo. And I was there about a month ago, actually, doing some filming. And it was a gem of a church. And I see there's been some really interesting comments coming about the stained glass. It really is spectacular. We're going to share that film, by the way, with you in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, a very warm welcome to our lunchtime lectures. These lectures are always completely free of charge. We never charge people to come to these lectures. So if you happen to see anyone commenting away with a link telling you to watch it elsewhere, please don't click those links. You can only watch them on our Facebook at the moment, but we are working on a YouTube link as well at the moment. By the way, do follow us on our social media. You can also tweet us. I put my Twitter handle here. So do have a look at that. I'll put on Peter's and our guest lecturer's link also. So if you'd like to tweet us any pictures of any church that you're visiting at the moment, please do. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can support us. Peter's mentioned about volunteering, but you can also join us as a member. So at the moment, we're running a really fantastic membership offer. Now, if you join us as a member from just £3.50 a month by direct debit, we will send you a free copy of this wonderful book. Now, this is The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals. Now, this was written by Dr. Richard Semp, who did a free lecture for us a few weeks ago. He's coming back in the autumn to do a couple more for us, so we'll be letting people know about that. But as I said, if you join us by direct debit from just £3.50 a month and use the offer code LECTURE, and that's lecture in capitals, you will get this for free. We've run out at the moment. We've ordered an exclusive print run. They are being printed and we should be receiving them in around mid-July. So we'll be posting out these books in August. But in the meantime, you'll get a really great membership pack. We've got a fantastic members magazine called Pinnacle that you'll receive, as well as invitations to exclusive events, and also our newly launched member exclusive lecture series. If you enjoyed today's lecture on Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral, and that's the cathedral built by Gilbert, do join us, because in a couple of weeks we're going to be looking at the proposed design of Lutyens, and the crypt was built, but it would have been the largest church in the world. So do join us for that. Now, there are also some other ways you can support us. You can donate through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk, or you can send us a text donation. So if you text CCT to 70331, that will give us a gift of £3. Finally, books. Also, you can buy, so today, Jon is from Purcell Architects, and a few weeks ago we did 20th Century Architecture, which is this book here, and this is the book we did. Now, Jon wrote a really fantastic entry in this, and I'm trying to find it for you. It's on Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral, today's topic for the lecture. But it's a really great book. It's got pictures of all the different churches and cathedrals built in the 20th century. There's 100 of them. We're selling it for a special price of just £20 plus postage and packaging. Normally it's £25. So if you'd like to get a copy of that, please do that on our website. Finally, before I pass you to Peter Ayres again, next week, we're joined by our former chairman, who is Lloyd Grossman. Some of you who've watched TV will remember Lloyd from that, but he's a fantastic author and he's a real fantastic champion for heritage. He's going to be talking to us about the elephant in Rome, Bernini, the popes, and the construction of the Eternal City. Now, he wrote a book on that topic, which is this one here. Now, you can buy that also on our website, and we'll post links to this book. Also, we're going to be posting out these next week, hopefully, or the week after. We can't go into the office as frequently as we'd like at the moment due to COVID restrictions. So our delivery is a little bit restricted, but do order them and we'll get them to you as soon as possible. Now, I'm going to pass you back to Peter Ayres, who's going to tell you a bit more about the Trust and also introduce Jon. But do let us know, everyone, where you are watching from. Do comment and let us know also if this is your first time. But if you've got any questions or any problems, please comment away and let us know.
Thanks, George. Yeah, do let us know. And if you're out and about visiting, do tweet us. That would be really good if you could, because it's always good to know that you guys are out there visiting our churches and seeing this. I'm stuck in my attic, as you can see here. Sometimes it's nice to know that you are all out there. So also, I know that there's been a lot of concern that Clement's disappeared to go off and work out how to volunteer for the Church Conservation Trust. He does it every week. I'm sure he'll be back at some point, but I can reassure you, I have a sleeping cat just behind me called Meg as well. So just to reassure you, there are animals in the production at some point. But today, I'm really pleased to welcome Jon Wright, who's a heritage consultant for Purcell Architects, and he specialises in the architectural history of and conservation practices for buildings of the 20th century. This is a very specialist area of work as well. He's a former case officer for the 20th Century Society and now a member of the working party for the UK chapter of DOCOMOMO. Jon has worked on some of the country's best-known modern buildings and fought for the survival of some of the most contentious of the post-war period. He's a genuine champion of 20th century architecture in this country, and we're very lucky to have him. He's going to give you a fascinating talk, I'm sure. And he gave a little teaser earlier before we were talking earlier that they've learned an awful lot by the work on this particular building. So without further ado, thank you to Jon for giving his time for free for the Church's Conservation Trust. Jon Wright, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter and George. It's a real pleasure to be doing this for the Church Conservation Trust, an organisation I've long admired. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the lecture. And go full screen. So today I'm going to talk about Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. I'm going to talk about it in two parts, really, the sort of baseline history, and then I'm going to give you some idea of the conservation challenges that the building continues to present, and look at some of the things that we've done to it. I think it's fair to say that the building has never really, until the last few years, had a comprehensive cycle of conservation efforts directed at it, and it has been it has been a contentious piece of architecture in some ways, not just for the city of Liverpool, but also in the context of post-war heritage generally. It presents, I think, a number of conservation issues and challenges for us that are, some of which are universally kind of important if we're going to learn about how to look after certainly some of the technical the details and certainly some of the materiality of buildings like this. So I think the work we've done, just like Peter alluded to, is potentially important for the future conservation efforts of post-war places of worship, and probably for post-war architecture generally, because the materials used in the construction of Liverpool Metropolitan, were widely being used in that period, and I'm talking about concrete, glass, and steel in particular. So I'll run through the baseline history, because some of the ways in which the building came to be about are particularly interesting, and have ramifications for the way in which we now look after it. And then, if I may, I'm going to look specifically at the conservation effort that we've directed at that part of the cathedral that we call the lantern, which is the top bit there with the crown on it. So there's really kind of two parts to this, and I hope that draws out both the general stuff, the history, but also, an essence of the detail in which we have applied to this building to look at its makeup and apply, good conservation practice. So there is the site before a cathedral was even considered. It was a huge workhouse site on the top of Brownlow Hill in Liverpool, and there had been a workhouse site pretty much since the late 18th century. And in the 1920s, it was acquired for the construction of a new cathedral. Now, a new Catholic cathedral in Liverpool had been mooted for some time, actually, and the first person to have a crack at designing it, though not on this site, was Pugin. But by the 1920s, the ideas have progressed. This site was chosen, and an architect this time was Lutyens. Now, you're going to hear a whole load more about this building in the lecture that was mentioned previously, so I won't give too much detail now, except that its dimensions were extraordinary. It was characteristically in a sequence of beautiful brick step backs and layered Portland stone that Lutyens have become famed for by this point. And one can certainly see echoes of the Tiapval memorial to the missing of the Somme, for example. And there was to be this enormous dome on the top that would have rivaled St. Peter's in Rome. Following Lutyens' design effectively running out of both time because of the Second World War, the tools were downed in 1941, and the enormous cost of building something like that, the next person to, the next architect to have a crack at a redesign was Adrian Gilbert Scott. And of course, his father had designed the Anglican Cathedral at the other end of Hope Street. It was very rationalised. It kept Lutyens' dome, and it obviously incorporated the crypt that had already been constructed by this point. But by the time Archbishop Heenan arrived in Liverpool in 1957, these plans too were scrapped. And it was really John Heenan who set the wheels in motion for a brand new and indeed modern cathedral in Liverpool. He was instrumental in pushing for a certain kind of design, and instrumental in setting up the competition that was launched in 1959-60 to architects worldwide to design a new cathedral for the Catholics of Liverpool. And the number of entrants to that competition produced an extraordinary display of both creativity and modernism. There were very few traditional designs. There had been a note in the brief that it was, if not to be experimental, then certainly to be something distinctly different from the Gothic of the Anglican Cathedral on the other end of Hope Street. Dennis Lasden, who you'll perhaps know from the work at the National Theatre or the University of East Anglia, the master of concrete in this country throughout the 1960s, proposed a sort of star shape. And many of the designs indeed were based on circular plans. Oliver Hill, quite bizarrely really, considering that he had been a pioneering modernist of the international style throughout the 1930s and early 40s, went for a sort of classicism, abstracted classicism, that kept the dome idea of Lutyens, but perhaps contributed one of the more odd entries. Archaeogram, the architectural profession's version of Monty Python throughout the 1960s, presented a rather brutalist affair with a sequence of interlocking geometric spaces, which didn't find much favour. And the one that came closest to being successful, other than Gibbert's, was Bailey's entry, which again sort of star-shaped with this expressive lotus leaf kind of canopy, and many of them featured, because Brownlow Hill sort of rises to a plateau, many of them featured enormous sets of steps rising to the cathedral entrance, and some of these things, some of these ideas leached into Gibbert's thinking or were expressed by Heenan and the panel working closely with Gibbert when he was chosen. And there are some interesting accounts of how he was chosen, but it seems by all accounts that his design rather leapt out at the judging panel. And the judging panel included Basil Spence. Basil Spence, of course, a notable modernist in his own right, but certainly with one foot in the traditional Scottish arts and crafts, the movement from which he came originally. Built Coventry Cathedral. And Coventry Cathedral and Liverpool have an important relationship because they are really sort of bookends of a similar, of the same decade, and they show the great variety in the traditional camp, traditional Anglican camp, and the rather more expressive and progressive architecture that was happening in the Catholic Church at this time. The brief for Gibbert was actually, rather difficult. Build a cathedral with £1 million, at least the shell of it. Cap off the half-completed Lutyens crypt, which you can see here, and make sure those spaces are usable. and provide a working cathedral inside 5 years. So it was a challenge. All those things presented a challenge individually, but combined, it was sort of miraculous that he was able to do it. And of course, it was an enormous team effort, but he oversaw the design, almost every part of the design, and called on a wide number of artists and designers and structural engineers to support him. And very much like Basil Spence, actually, he sort of diarised what he was doing. So if you haven't read Phoenix at Coventry or the Metropolitan Cathedral of Christ the King in Liverpool by Spence and Gilbert respectively, then they are unique pieces of architectural literature because they both describe the inner workings and design decisions of both those cathedrals in great detail. And they were immensely important documents for us to read when coming back to look at the building, particularly Gilbert's book, which is less emotive than Spence's, but far more detailed in the sort of design process. Here is Gilbert with the original model of his cathedral, explaining its structural makeup. And its structural makeup is really quite simple. There are 16 concrete ribs supported by 2 ring beams, one at the base of the uprights that form the chapels, some of which you can see in situ there, which sat between the ribs, and another ring beam at the base of what Gilbert called the lantern, or the roof of the cathedral. And he had settled on this kind of conical design as a result of some serious thought about geometries, but also as the result of thinking about how the building would be seen on the skyline, and indeed in contrast to the Anglican Cathedral at the other end of Hope Street. And he was very cautious not to challenge Gilbert Scott's building in any way. And if you like, this is his sort of geometric or abstracted classical response to the Gothic at the other end of the street. He wanted simple forms. He didn't want to challenge Gilbert Scott's building, but he did want to provide Liverpool with another crown. And he thought of it very much like that. And so the whole building is really discussed by Gilbert in his book, both structurally and visually, aesthetically, as a crown, complete crown. And that was very, I think, persuasive to the Catholic Church, who were very keen to see the building, which had been decided to be dedicated to Christ the King, to have that kind of physical makeup. And it was a highly visible site. And so this building was considered by Gilbert from the very start to be a highly visible landmark, which I think is why he poured or considered the lantern and the crown on top, to be the most important components, because from distance, very often, they're the key things that you see. I wrote, along with my colleague Rebecca Burrows, the conservation management plan for Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral 2 years ago, and last year completed the conservation management plan for Coventry Cathedral. And in both documents, it was really important to look carefully at the international context in which the buildings sit. And I think that's helped both cathedrals to understand themselves a bit better. And in the case of Liverpool, where an issue of taste had rather dogged it, and I'll come on to the notion of perceived architectural determinism or failure a bit later, but it was important to look at some of the precedents for where Gilbert's design had come from. And in the thrusting forward of the bell tower at the top of the steps, Gilbert very much echoed Marcel Breuer's work at Collegeville, Minnesota, with this standalone, west screen with a bell tower that also formed the entrance, and of course looked to the other Catholic buildings around the world. And I looked at several round cathedrals. The one in Rio was important in consideration, which is staggering if you've never seen a picture of that. But also, perhaps more popularly, the Cathedral of Brasilia that was designed by Niemeyer. Not many people know, I think, that Gilbert had a sort of a test run for Liverpool. And it's this building, which is Grade 2 listed and is near Manchester. It's the Hopwood Chapel, built for a school, actually. Completed just a couple of years before the completion of Liverpool. And whilst there was some overlap in the construction timings, I think it's fair to say from the documentation we uncovered that, some of the initial ideas that found their way into Liverpool's physical makeup, were tested out at Hopwood. Certainly this congregation in the round idea, but not having a completely round building. The central high lantern with dau de verre or glass set in concrete, exposed concrete facades, and on the inside, a fairly rough and ready makeup that one might realistically align with brutalism, which is not necessarily all about concrete, though it has perhaps come to mean that more than anything else, but much more about the use of honesty in materials. So if it's brick, then it looks like a brick, and if it's concrete, it looks like a concrete beam or whatever. And so it was at Hopwood. And I think it's fair to say that Gilbert tested out some of the appearances of these materials and how they worked together, and indeed, the way in which he was going to lay the thing out, the seating, the organ, the sanctuary, and so on. So construction of Liverpool began in 1962. Here's the concrete core going up. It wasn't precast. It was, some of the components were, but most of it was poured in situ. And the structural frame was a very solid thing, and remains a very solid thing. It's really a masterpiece of engineering in that sense for the period. And there were obviously challenges, one of them being that these concrete ribs have to sink through Lutyens' crypt. And so what you see when you go into the crypt now, certainly the backroom spaces, or where the storage is these enormous things coming straight through the ceiling onto the floor. And the way in which Gilbert articulated that to sit on top of Lutyens' crypt and cap it, is one of the sort of masterstrokes of the building, because it's obviously an entirely new cathedral on top of a half-built other cathedral, and they're both historic assets and both listed in their own right, which presented challenges for us too. Part of it he got round by moving the entire thing to the south, so that really the majority of the crypt is roofed over with an outdoor plaza, and the two things don't conjoin too much. You can see that plaza there on the right hand side, that he's just capped off, and he built two pyramids either side that contain staircases to get up from the street onto the top of the plaza there. And his original designs had, a set of steps down to Mount Pleasant that weren't able to be constructed in the original scheme, which was a shame at the beginning, because you had to obviously come round to the front from the plaza. And there it is, just after completion. You can see the capping of the crypt and the cathedral there, in contrast to the Gothic building of Gilbert Scott's at the other end of the street. Well, the building itself is really, like Coventry, I suppose, a sort of repository of some of the most important and interesting post-war artists and designers. And this drawing that was completed a year after the building was, tried to indicate the structural and component nature of the building and the various spaces within it. You enter through this bell tower that's rather like Breuer's at Collegeville, that's decorated with William Mitchell's carvings, and the west doors are also by him, into an entrance foyer that then leads into this vast circular nave. And that nave was linked to the lower spaces by a ramp that you can just see here, which leads down to the undercroft. There were several ways up onto the plaza, the steps here, and at the front through a pathway that ran here. But Gibbard's original plan to have a vast set of central stairs wasn't realised until 2002, actually. And so what you can see there are the main ways that people got into the building. Each one of the dedicated chapels, and indeed each one of a different design architecturally, sat within the ribs and were meant to be, both separate and part of the bigger nave. So most of them were open. There were no doors or anything. A couple of them had screens, but actually they were really open to the space. Acoustic panels on the ceiling and the lantern above brought light straight down onto the sanctuary and the central high altar. Gilbert also designed on the outside an external altar, so that large outdoor services could take place. I think they still do from time to time, but they were a regular thing when the building opened. This is showing one of them. I think that's in that there was some echoing of the way in which the buildings in Rio and Brasilia operate, with this kind of outdoor services that were welcoming to everybody. So there was both an inward-looking and circular kind of coming together on the inside, a sort of enclosure, but there was also, making use of this enormous plaza, a vast public space on the outside, in which the northern side of the building rather, opened itself out to the city. The building was consecrated on the 4th of May 1967. This is a shot from the opening brochure, and obviously shows this extraordinary circular nave. The floor, which you can see there, was a circular, concentric circular cross with geometric patterns. The arms of the cross going out to the east and west doors, and the north and south going to, the north to the chapel, and the south to the front door. The west doors are, like so many things in the cathedral, a creation, an artistic creation, in isolation, really, that many things came together in the creation of this building, which were, incredible pieces of artwork in their own right. And William Mitchell who so did the Stations of the Cross at Clifton Cathedral, was well known by this point for his abstract geometric or figurative forms in concrete or in wood or in plaster. He worked in a great variety of materials, and he was endlessly creative in terms of buildings decoration, and his work can be found all over the country. He just died actually fairly recently, but there's a good book about his work, and I think these doors are one of his best creations. They're a strange mixture of bronze and other ceramic forms fused together on a wooden frame. They're incredibly heavy, and when they slid shut, they presented a complete artwork at the front of the building. Here they are being constructed, and William Mitchell is the chap with his hand on his hip on the left there. So, like I said, the interior is really a repository of some of the best artistic talents of the post-war period. Elizabeth Frink did the crucifix. Margaret Traherne did some of the stained glass and some of the paintings. Robert Brumby did the Virgin and Child in the St Mary Chapel, and John Piper and Patrick Rentians did other bits of glass and the lantern specifically. Gilbert himself did the baldacchino and the organ design, which wasn't made by him but designed by him, which featured, as you can see here, these trumpets, which kind of extend out from the organ massing as if there's a bunch of angels there. The baptistry, which is a superb and almost sort of space age space, was one of the only areas of the building that didn't have any colour in it, and it relied instead on the rather stark and black and white geometric pattern, and some extraordinary light fittings in the roof, which are not in this picture. But the interior is really not a static thing, and Gilbert worked quite closely with Piper, Rentians and Traherne to make sure that the colour and mood of the interior, particularly the nave, changed immensely depending on where the sun was. So the building never, you could sit there throughout the day and the colours would change, and there would be, a sort of emotive reaction and a sort of, not a static, but a moving, architectural experience. And, I recommend going on a sunny day and just sitting in the nave for 3 hours, because the changes are actually quite marked, and the colours are quite, incredibly powerful. Now we arrived, we started work on Liverpool in 2017, and at that point it was exactly 50 years old, the building, and it had had some celebrations of that. But I think it's fair to say that it had had a turbulent history in terms of its structural makeup, and indeed in terms of its popularity or otherwise. And despite the fact that there's what one might call a total synthesis here of art, design, and architecture, sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, if you like, there had been problems with it from the very start. Part of that was due to the speed with which it went up. Part of that was due to the innovative range of materials and technologies that were employed. But there were clearly inherent problems with the building since its construction. Now, the most serious of those was leaks in the aluminium roof, which began probably very soon after construction, and indeed the failure of the tesserae, or the mosaic, the blue mosaic tiles that Gilbert had covered all of the ribs with. They had started to fail and fall off, and some of these, ribs, obviously are extending quite high above public spaces, and so there was some issues there. So a couple of things happened to the building. In 1992, the paving on the entire plaza was taken up and a new waterproof membrane was put in. And with a Historic England Places of Worship grant, which had begun in the early 90s, this GRP panelling was put onto the structural supports. So actually all the tesserae, all the mosaic survives underneath these panels. And we are awaiting a time when either there's the money or the technical ability to take these GRP panels off and reinstate the tesserae, which by and large probably, though I haven't, I've only seen certain small areas, survives underneath these panels. The other thing that was important to mention was the water ingress in the lantern, and I'm going to come on to speak about the lantern in more detail in a minute. Now, the lantern was a very interesting piece of work because it's really a piece of engineering and a piece of art and the roof of the cathedral all at the same time. Now, that presents just about the most interesting confluence of conservation challenges one might hope for, if that's the right word, because the way in which you care for a piece of art, a piece of engineering, or the roof of a building, generally differ quite a lot. And so we applied to, this is Purcell I'm talking about, applied to the Getty Conservation Institute for some money to look carefully at the lantern and how we might look after it. Because alongside all the other problems that the building had faced, this was perhaps the most important, because water getting in through the lantern immediately and directly affected, whenever it rained, the sanctuary below. And that was tremendously difficult for anyone taking services there, because obviously water is coming straight through into the lantern and down into the building. So it's also a visible issue. The lantern could so easily have been designed quite differently. This on the left here is Gilbert's early modelling of what he was really after, and it showed actually a much more complex matrix of dalles de verre than the one that was originally constructed, which you can see here on the right. Dalles de verre is the process of setting coloured glass inside a concrete or ceramic matrix as a structural component of the building, thereby creating this kind of look on the outside, but on the inside creating a sort of coloured mixture of colours interior. Now, the people who designed the lantern were John Piper and Patrick Rentians. I probably don't need to introduce either of those gentlemen, but John Piper was really the artist, if you like, and Rentians was really the stained glass expert. And both had done a great deal of ecclesiastical work up until this point, and they had most notably worked with Basil Spence on the Baptistry window at Coventry. Now, in the Baptistry window at Coventry, I think it's fair to say that they would have liked a great deal more freedom in the abstraction of the coloured light that they used to evoke the sort of image that they were looking for, or the aesthetic they were looking for. But Spence didn't really give them that opportunity, and I think they abstracted it as far as they could, but they were rather constrained by this, what they called nutmeg grater of Basil Spence's design, which basically handed them a sort of checkerboard of choices to put various colours of glass or sequences of individual stained glass windows, and only when you stood back, did the whole thing work together, because you have to come back quite far to sort of cancel out the black squares of the nutmeg grater, if you see what I mean. But Gilbert gifted Piper and Rentians the chance to go, if you like, a stage further, and I think there's obviously a very important relationship, therefore, between what they achieved in Coventry and what they finally achieved in Liverpool. And I think, in some ways, Liverpool is what they were pushing for in Coventry, but couldn't achieve because of the structural makeup of that side of the building. And so the two windows have remarkable similarities, and the original idea was to, in three main colours, represent the Holy Trinity, and that those colours would change as the sun moved round the building, and that the glass would be held in place by as open and an abstract as possible concrete matrix of structural supports that the glass would sit inside. Now, Piper and Rentians made a full-size cartoon of every single panel, and then had a structural engineer come and walk all over it and tell them which one may work and which one may not work, and where they would have to move the various structural supports if they were to make that individual panel work. And through this process, they basically arrived at the final design and painted the entire thing in full size by hand. The construction, panel by panel, was fascinating. The down to there was hand cut, so the pieces of glass were hand edged, put into place by Piper and Rentians inside the concrete frame. Two strands of carbon fibre were placed between them in the matrix, and then on the top was poured over an epoxy resin, which is what's happening in this picture. Now, that resin had been developed by the Shell Oil Company specifically for this purpose. It had not been properly tested. It had never been made before, and remains a bespoke product for this job. And I mean, it is a mixture of various technologies, but was designed to hold the glass blocks in place, no matter whether their edges were rough or smooth. Some of the edges could come out of the mold, and some of them had to be hand finished. And so this entire, really the entire kind of structural integrity of the thing rested on the overall concrete frame, the structural components within it, and this resin and glass fibre mix. Here in 1966 is the lantern slowly being constructed panel by panel. There are 16 ribs to the building, and the spaces in between each one are full of about 10 to 12 panels on average. It varies. So there are a considerable number of these things to be constructed. And here's the crane on the left lifting one of them into position on the crown. And on completion, the colours were extraordinarily bright. The glass really lit the sanctuary, and it was a tremendous technical as well as artistic achievement from them both, and really, was the crown to Gilbert's building. It was lit from the inside, so you could see it at night, and it was, tremendously visible from a long way away. Gilbert hadn't, I don't think, counted on the smog that Liverpool had always produced, and that immediately started to kind of settle in the resin, and there was early attempts to clean it, but it was quite immediately apparent that it was going to dull quite quickly. There it is, a few years ago, showing Liverpool's two very distinctly different crowns that sit on this ridge above the city. So the key problem that we faced, and that we went to the Getty Conservation Fund for money, was to find out what was going on in the water ingress through the lantern into the building. And although it had been known for some time, probably since the mid-1980s, when some of the first work was tried to try and solve the problem, nobody really knew what was happening at all. Nobody really knew where the water was coming from, how it was getting in. It's such a vast structure that it was quite easy to assume that perhaps it was traveling inside the matrix. It was coming in. Was it coming in the roof and traveling on the inside of the glass and then down? Just nobody knew anything. So we went and got £139,000 from the Getty, who had a program that's no longer running, unfortunately, called the Keeping It Modern program, where they gave out grants for 20th century listed buildings worldwide. And this in itself placed Liverpool in a pretty impressive list. They had, funded buildings by Louis Kahn in Philadelphia. They had funded buildings by Le Corbusier in India, Ahmedabad in particular, that were in a poor state. And they had, the Getty had given a significant amount of intellectual and practical advice and efforts to 20th century listed buildings worldwide, and they gave Liverpool a considerable grant to get to the bottom of this problem and try to solve it. I think that probably ranks, along with this one, as the two most scary photos I've ever taken. But we went to look at what was going on inside the lantern, and of course, I'll just go back to that. The water getting in here is fundamental to the way in which visitors and people experience the building, and water dripping in while there are services going on was just awful. So this is an important problem to solve. You can see that ring beam there and the lights around. And what was happening was that water was coming down the inside, pooling on the ring beam, and getting so deep it was pouring over into the sanctuary. So first thing to really do was assess the building for where this water was coming from. And we also looked at the sort of accretion of all the visual clutter that had built up in the lantern. So when we first went up there, we went up this gantry here. These are photos from my first visit. We were sort of astounded to see that this gantry, for example, which is fully visible from the nave, all the lights, the railings, the extra fittings that have been added over time, haven't done the lantern any favors really, and some of these things were exacerbating the water ingress issue. Very frightening. Yeah, the top of the country. So you can see evidence of the water pooling on each one of the concrete beam tops there. This is not me, thankfully. My colleague Matt, rather braver than I, abseiled on the outside of the building to look at to take a photographic record actually of every single panel, to work out if they could spot anything, and to do a sort of condition survey of each one. Perhaps who's looking for consistency in defect, or things that he might be able to spot as consistent problems. One of them was cracking, and there obviously was, if not some structural problems, some of the issues with the dowels were that they had failed due to pressure. But this wasn't particularly common. We saw some of it in some, like the one at the bottom right there. It was the entire dowel. So we were clearly going to have to think about how in the world one might start to think about getting that out and putting a new one in, or what else you might do to repair it. And Perhaps the most interesting and important thing, I think, is that we had to face a number of previous interventions, and I mentioned at the beginning how important some of the conservation work that's happening on Liverpool and has happened in the last few years has implications for the way in which 20th century churches, but maybe even 20th century buildings, are looked at in the future. And I could say this for many other 20th century buildings that I've looked at in the last few years, where actually we've had to address not just maybe some form of failure in the structural fabric or makeup of the building itself, but the exacerbation of that, or indeed sometimes the creation of an entirely new problem by well-meaning conservation efforts of the past. Now, I'm sure that there's a sort of cycle of that in every period of architecture, and that perhaps in the 1930s we didn't quite know how to look after certain bits of Victorian fabric as well as we do now, and we are in that cycle at the moment of learning and trading ideas about how we look after the materiality and protect the fabric of buildings from the more recent past. And so what we found was, people had tried previous efforts to just stick mastic over the joints, which is that red picture there. That's not me graffitiing the building, by the way, on the top right, but that is a silicone wash that was put over the entire lantern, which had the effect of, well, not really keeping the water out, but also misting up the glass so that you could hardly see through it, thus rendering the artistic qualities of it rather, really affecting the way in which the colours shone through. And other repairs. The one at the bottom right there, you can see that white line above the epoxy resin matrix, where just someone has stuffed a load of glue in there to try and plug a hole. Now, all these things done all over the building aren't minor incremental adaptations. They actually collectively added up to pretty major interventions, some of which were causing problems that the building didn't have, and some of which were trying to address perceived notions of failure without any proper evidence. And still, none of these things solved where the water was coming from. Perhaps the most destructive piece of conservation that took place happened in moderately recently in 2005, when a series of aluminium flashings were put on the joints of every single part of the lantern, and this had the effect of creating a drip rail, effectively. And from our calculations later, it's pretty clear that this probably caused more water to come in the building rather than throwing it away from the building, which was what it was supposed to do, because all you need is a gust of wind to blow all this stuff back onto the face of the building. And so, again, another issue that perhaps was the result of trying to address a failure, but having quite the opposite effect. There had also been some sort of mortaring between the joints, and so these images show some of the other repairs that had taken place in isolated areas. But some of those areas were quite visible even from the ground. And so if you add all these things together, they kind of represented a fairly intrusive and detrimental impact on the significance of the lantern. We looked at every single panel, we drew every single panel, we photographically surveyed every single panel. And this is one of the Purcell drawings showing that. And we looked at the rate that the water was coming in. We tried to register the humidity and the condensation. Tobit Curtis, who I'm sure is known to some of you, did some environmental monitoring inside, which included looking at the thermal imaging of the lantern and where where it was hottest at various times of day to see if condensation rates were different. Now, all that basically added up to the fact that the water was and is coming in through a series of millions and millions of tiny capillary holes inside the resin matrix, and that there's no way that really you can address that without either reconstructing the matrix or finding some way to block those holes up without changing the nature of either the appearance or functional characteristics of the lantern as a load-bearing thing. So the notion of failure, if you like, this thing that the building had faced for so long, water coming in, was treated by us as a result of all these efforts as something that was just really a fundamental part of the building's nature. So we stopped thinking of it as a failure and started thinking about it as something we could potentially solve by stripping away the later conservation efforts, looking again at what was really important about the building, and the lantern, its significance, and treating it as a piece of art in its own right. And that led us to constructing very carefully a sequence of sort of gutters on the inside that collect and take the water back outside. So we sort of accepted the problem, if you like, that the water's coming in, and we're channeling it back outside without altering the way in which the building looks. And that has allowed us to take off all the other stuff, take off the mastic and the silicone wash, and very much clean up the way in which the buildings, which the sanctuary is lit by the glass. So that's where we've arrived to, really. And I'm going to end there because I know that some of you might have some questions. But I think as a final point, it's worth saying that kind of conservation effort, where you just go back to fundamental principles rather than try and solve the problem, is the thing that's really driven this project and has implications for churches and post-war buildings elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was a phenomenal lecture. Everyone, I'm sorry about Clement there. He's just woken. There's been some fantastic questions coming in already. There's been lots, because I'm a huge fan of 20th century architecture. I've visited it once. I'm looking forward to visiting it again. You are transported to encounter. But I'd be really interested to, if you weren't a fan of this lecture, so do plus through debit lecture members. This and you go into first. also for people who had limitations being
the answer to there has been a lift installed in the lobby to up into the nave. In some ways, it was built in because, actually, unlike Spencer Coventry, which is all steps, Gilbert borrowed the idea of internal ramps from Le Corbusier. So to come from some of the crypt spaces up into the nave, it's a sort of concentric ramp that comes up into the nave directly. But yeah, the front steps, when they were constructed in 2002, had a lift installed because it wasn't easy to get from the car park into the nave, but that's been solved.
Thanks, John. And quite an interesting question, I think, that's come in, is cathedrals of all ages pose problems for conservation experts. As it is built of concrete, is this cathedral likely to be more difficult to preserve for the next 500 years or so than, say, cathedrals built with stone?
What a fantastic question. I wish I had 24 hours to answer that. The science of concrete repair is no longer in its infancy, but we haven't come particularly far, really, not compared to what we know about stone, which is a much more consistent material. We can guess at its properties, and we can, probably have a decent track record of looking after it. Concrete can be quite varied, particularly if it was poured on site. So every batch is going to be slightly different, and the way in which it settles is going to be slightly different, and therefore the way in which it erodes or is environmentally affected by wind or water is going to be different. So you have to apply the same basic principles, but some different technical sort of data to how much you look after it. I think concrete's conservation rests on how well it was made in the first place. I mentioned Dennis Lasdon at the beginning, who really is the sort of Caravaggio of concrete, if you like. So the National Theatre, as long as everything else stays in place, I think probably will be there in 500 years' time. His concrete sort of quality control was second to none. Liverpool went up quickly. As far as we know, it's got no structural issues at the moment. But I think, as we go forward with 20th century buildings conservation, concrete is right at the centre. And the Getty actually have just published a new book of case studies on concrete conservation worldwide, which if anyone wants to follow up on that, show the kind of current international thinking on how to look after it.
And linked into that whole idea of what you just mentioned about Getty and the concrete challenges possibly going forward. One question I think sort of links really neatly into this is, why do you think these concrete buildings leaked? Don't we have the Romans, the expertise of the Romans to build on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think obviously the Romans had a form of concrete, and concrete's an old material. We've been using it for a long time. Its properties are quite well known, but we didn't start reinforcing it with steel until fairly recently, and therein lies one of the bigger problems with it, because if water gets to that steel, the steel expands, and you have a number of associated issues that are quite technically difficult to deal with, because you've got to get at the concrete, get at the steel and take it out or replace it or treat it or whatever. I think it's fair to say also that the buildings of the 1960s differ very much from the buildings of the 1950s and the 1970s, the 2 decades either side, in that there was a tremendous artistic and experimental edge to architecture that almost came directly from applied art and the worlds of applied art. The 50s were quite solemn, architecturally until the later decades, and they still had one foot in the camp of traditional architectures. And in the 1970s, we'd started to temper, the excesses of the 1960s, but with cheap energy, experimental ideas from the avant-garde knocking around, and an explosion in new materiality. The 1960s left us with a very interesting but quite difficult to look after sequence of buildings, and I think Liverpool is one of those, one of the most challenging, because it went up in a period of cheap energy, new materials, untested techniques and fabrics, and we got some issues as a result of that, no question.
And I suppose you just mentioned there that the cathedral was built in the 60s. And one question that came in, again, it links quite nicely to what you just said about the 60s, but medieval cathedral churches evolved over, say, 500-600 years. Might it be possible to consider the building and conservation used at places like Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral as being very similar to the work of NASA, who have made huge strides, obviously, in a very short amount of time?
Yeah, I certainly like to think of myself as a NASA scientist now. Yeah, I'm going to keep that. That's an interesting point. I mean, I think the idea of conserving something that was a single phase set piece is one of the most interesting and remarkable challenges that faces anyone who wants to look after 20th century architecture, whether it's ecclesiastical or not. But ecclesiastical buildings already have this inbuilt notion of, a sequence of events, spaces, and features that all kind of need to be in place, no matter where they are in the building, and no matter what forces shaped their design. But Liverpool and Coventry, and to some extent Clifton, though it's just not quite as complete, Liverpool and Coventry. And those three, by the way, are the only post-war cathedrals in the country. You have to go back to Guildford, I suppose, for another 20th century one. Represent enormous amounts of artistic and intellectual effort to focus on one place at one time, all these people coming together. Whereas the buildings of earlier periods are rather the amalgamation, or these things have been accrued over time. So there is a difference. It's funny that you mentioned science, because we applied some new thinking about how to measure significance in this building. In a medieval cathedral, it's fairly obvious. It's probably based on historic development. You might value the medieval pieces more than the Victorian. You might value the Victorian more than the 1920s or Edwardian pieces, and that would be fairly reasonably understood, I suppose. But it's different for individual set pieces. You have to make judgments about which bits worked and which bits didn't, and which bits were better artistically or aesthetically. And because the whole thing's supposed to be seen as one, that becomes rather challenging. So yeah, I think the science, if we are NASA scientists, there's still papers to be written.
I think that's I think there'd be a lot of interest in people sort of wanting to read those papers. So watch this space, everyone, and see how these conservation techniques develop. So John, we've got time for maybe a couple more questions I'm going to try and squeeze in. Someone's mentioned the Pantheon in Rome is built of concrete. How does this differ to modern concrete?
Well, it differs in a number of key ways. First of all, it's not reinforced in any way, so they weren't using steel. And in some ways, it's the result of consistent repair and effort. And it's had a long conservation effort directed at it because it's been there a lot longer. And it was, it's not hugely different in terms of its materiality, but as I said before, that all the mixes were fairly different, and it's not in any way an industrialized process. So there are those key differences in terms of it being handmade and hand batched and so on. There are probably, therefore, more discrepancies in the concrete of Liverpool than there are in the Pantheon, I would think, because of that. So it's the industrial shift that's kind of important, and also there's it's a structural material in Liverpool only for the frame. Really, you have to remember that all of the chapels are brick, so it's just the superstructure. It's not a complete build thing. So there's a much bigger mix of materials at Liverpool than there is in Rome.
And no, absolutely. You mentioned to me earlier, we were talking about the leadership at the church and sort of their, how the building has been received, certainly within Liverpool and nation, since it was built over 50 years ago. It may not have been appreciated, originally when built, and now there seems to have been a change. One question, what's the attitude of the current church leadership to the building? How supportive were they to retaining and restoring the building? And was there anything you would have liked to do that you couldn't?
Well, it was the whole reason, George, for calling this lecture Full Circle. And if there is a meta narrative to the thing, then it is that, this sort of taste issue, both in Liverpool and beyond, I think, is coming full circle for buildings of this period. It is, and has always been, part of the historic nature of the way in which we appreciate the built environment, that the buildings that we grow up with are not always the ones we adore. And we can really love the new stuff and we can really love the old stuff, but the stuff that sits in the middle, certainly the stuff that was my parents' generation and beyond, has associations for certain generations that maybe younger people don't have, and that's a worldwide thing. I suppose it's characterized best by thinking of it as the older something is, the more attractive it is, and the idea, which in art is called the ugly valley, that everything has to move through a place where it's not appreciated before it finally comes full circle. And I think in the last few years you've seen huge appreciation for everything mid-century, for example, and in Liverpool, I think, as in places like Plymouth or Coventry that were heavily bombed and reconstructed, there is an emerging sort of appreciation for what happened mid-century and post-war, because the generation is now doing that appreciating. It doesn't have the same relationship to it as the generation before.
Thanks, John. I'm going to ask you one final question, and it's a really tough one, I'm afraid. So, Liverpool has two cathedrals on the same street. How do you go about, or should I say, do you think there's one that's more successful than the other?
You're asking a fan of 20th century architecture to choose between two buildings of the 20th century, which are both superb in their own way and in totally different ways. I mean, I'm going to cop out of that completely by saying that I think Liverpool is, unique and special because it has both of them. And I think Gilbert is to be congratulated for realizing the importance of the Anglican building and doing something that didn't in any way compete, but did very much contrast. And both of them have had, tremendous conservation effort, and both of them are very loved. And of course, sitting at the end of, the appropriately named Hope Street, convey everything that you want to convey about, various forms of Christianity that exist in the city and the country. I mean, it's a tremendously special place in that regard. So I completely don't answer your question at all.
Thank you, John. And I think that's, a fair point to make. Both these cathedrals in Liverpool are spectacular in their own way, and both marvels of human ingenuity and, engineering. So everyone, thank you so much for joining the lecture. Again, thank you, John, for today's lecture. I'm sorry earlier, before we went into question time, my connection keeps breaking. We are working on it. It's to do with my internet speed. It can't keep up, I'm afraid. So I'm working from home at the moment. But in a few weeks, I'll be hopefully back in the office for Thursday lectures. So that should sort it. But it works better on this. So I'm just going to repeat what we said at the start before the went into question time. So firstly, I had a question for everyone. Did you come to this lecture with a sort of a, did you not particularly, were you not a fan of Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral, sorry. And as a result of the lecture, do you have a better and deeper appreciation of this wonderful space? I say wonderful because I'm a huge fan of it. So I'd really like to know, have we converted you to being a huge fan of the cathedral? Now, as we said at the start of the lecture, if you'd like to get a copy of 100 Churches, 100 Years, please do. You can buy it from our website for just £20 plus postage packaging. The RRP is £25. And as we said earlier, John's written a fantastic contribution to this about Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. And I can't actually find it now, and I did earlier. It's about 3 pages long, but it's got Coventry Cathedral in there as well. So John's mentioned about Coventry. It's also got Clifton in there as well. So, and Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. So do, if you'd like to get a copy of that, please buy that from our website. As we said at the start of the lecture, if you become a member of the CCT, so these lectures are always free of charge. We're going to continue with them. I'm booked up now till next January with lectures. So if you've got any ideas for future lectures, let us know. But if you'd like to show your support to us, please do consider becoming a member with us. It's £3.50 a month. And if you join by direct debit and use the offer code LECTURE, that's lecture in capitals, you'll get a free copy of this book. Finally, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. But next week, we're joined by our former chairman, Lloyd Grossman, who some of you may know from TV. He's a huge champion of heritage, and he wrote a book last year called An Elephant in Rome, Bernini and the Popes and the Making of the Eternal City. And that's the topic of his lecture next week, and you can buy that book from us also on our website at the moment. But if you've got any ideas for lectures, let us know. If you've enjoyed today's lecture, please let us know again. But thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. We've really enjoyed your questions. I've loved seeing some of your comments coming in. We hope to see you at a future lunchtime lecture. But once again, thank you so much, John, for today's lecture.
You're very welcome. Brilliant. Thank you.